Hi everybody, thanks for joining me as I continue to examine Norman Geisler and Frank Turek's I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist from my atheist perspective. In this video we're going to cover chapter 2 of the book, which is subtitled Why Should Anyone Believe Anything at All? And in this chapter Geisler and Turek continue to examine claims that truth cannot actually be known and continue to argue that truth can in fact be known. And the chapter opens with a quotation from Blaise Pascal. And the quotation reads, "People almost invariably arrive at their beliefs not on the basis of proof, but on the basis of what they find attractive." The irony of this statement being made by a Christian and then cited by other Christians in defense of Christianity is lost on Geisler and Turek, I'm quite certain. Geisler and Turek begin their chapter with the question, why do people believe what they believe? To answer this question, they turn to James Sire, who is a fellow Christian apologist, although they do not explicitly identify him as such in their writing about him here. And James Sire conducts seminars on that very question, why do people believe what they believe? Sire divides the reasons people have for belief into 4 categories. And those 4 categories are sociological reasons, and those reasons would include things like parents, friends, society, or culture. Psychological reasons, which would include things like comfort, peace of mind, meaning, purpose, hope, identity. Religious reasons, including scripture, your pastor or your priest, guru, rabbi, imam, or church. And philosophical reasons, which include consistency, coherence, and completeness, and that is whether or not a given belief is the best explanation for the available evidence. As he questions students at his seminar, Sire demonstrates that no single category of evidence is sufficient on its own to justify a belief. Beliefs based on sociological, psychological, or religious reasons must be checked against the philosophical reasons. In other words, are these beliefs consistent, coherent, and the best explanation for the evidence before they can be taken seriously and reasonably believed? And that actually seems reasonable to me. And by the way, in his presentation, Sire folds science in with philosophy, essentially erasing the modern distinction between the two and just calling it all ways of finding the truth underneath the umbrella term of philosophy. In case you were wondering where science was on his list there. Quote, "As Pascal said, people almost invariably arrive at their beliefs not on the basis of proof, but on the basis of what they find attractive. But truth is not a subjective matter of taste. It's an objective matter of fact." Sometimes, as I said in the previous video, the view of truth presented here by Geisler and Turek is far too rigid and narrow, it seems to me, to be of much use to anyone, especially when speaking about things like morality and philosophy, which are not objective matters of fact, almost by definition, and yet that is exactly the type of truth that Geisler and Turek are addressing most often in this book so far. Someone left a comment on the previous video in this series saying that they were a philosophy student and that they found it incredibly frustrating to see how the subject of truth and the nature of truth and whether or not we can ever know truth was being handled in this book. That question, what is truth, has been discussed and argued over by philosophers for literally thousands of years. And Geisler and Turek treat it as a settled question. They basically just throw all of the thousands of years of philosophy and debate and discussion out the window and say, no, 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 truth is this. This is what truth is. Now, I'm not a philosopher, as you can probably tell, nor am I a particularly well-read student of philosophy, but I agree, this is frustrating the way they handle this issue, and it really can't be taken seriously. Western logic versus Eastern logic? Geisler and Turek move now from James Sire to another fellow apologist, who this time they do actually identify as such, Ravi Zacharias. And an anecdote that Zacharias tells about a conversation he supposedly had with a college professor about the difference between Western and Eastern logic. The professor in Zacharias' anecdote defines the difference between Western and Eastern logic this way. In the West, we use either-or logic, while in the East, they use both-and logic. And according to this professor, therefore, the Christian doctrine of salvation can't be true going by Eastern logic, because salvation comes both through the blood of Christ and through other ways as well, not either through the blood of Christ or not at all. And Zacharias goes on to say in his anecdote, as related to us by Geisler and Turek, that this professor invited him out to lunch where he further explained the difference between Eastern both-and logic and Western either-or logic. And Zacharias eventually settles this argument by employing the Roadrunner tactic. See, it's not just Geisler and Turek that use the Roadrunner tactic. Everybody who's smart and who you should listen to uses the Roadrunner tactic. Zacharias asks the professor if, when in India, he must either use both-and logic or no logic at all. And at that point, the professor admits that the either-or nature of his argument is unavoidable. And Zacharias is quoted as saying, "Even in India, we look both ways before we cross the street, because it is either me or the bus, not both of us." And Geisler and Turek compare logic to other fields, asking whether we would accept such an east-west distinction in mathematics or physics. Would we say that there's such a thing as Western gravity and Eastern gravity, for example? Quote, "In fact, despite what relativists believe, things work in the East just like they work everywhere else. In India, just like in the United States, buses hurt when they hit you, 2 + 2 = 4, and the same gravity keeps everyone on the ground." Have you ever heard a more absurd straw man argument in your life? But wait, they're not done. Geisler and Turek continue. Quote, "Likewise, murder is wrong there just as it is here. Truth is truth no matter what country you come from, and truth is truth no matter what you believe about it." So let me pause here for a few minutes and spend a bit of time elaborating on just a few of the things that are wrong with what Geisler and Turek, and through them Zacharias, are saying here. For a start, let's talk about what's going on with this anonymous, probably apocryphal professor. First, and I say this as a layman, I admit, I don't think he knows shit about Eastern philosophy. I don't know shit about Eastern philosophy either, but I think I know just enough about it to suspect that the professor in the Zacharias anecdote knows even less about it than I do. Despite carrying on an impassioned and supposedly lengthy conversation with Zacharias about the differences between Eastern and Western logic, complete with diagrams drawn on the spot as they ate lunch to illustrate his arguments, we are told nothing specific about the professor's position other than that vague bullshit about the difference between either or and both and logic. What was he drawing? What did he say? What points, however erroneous, was he making in his discussion with Zacharias? We aren't told any of this. And am I really supposed to believe that this professor, who argued so vociferously for so long for his position, was silenced by Zacharias deploying the facile rhetorical trick they call the Roadrunner tactic? I just find that a little too difficult to believe. I suspect that the main purpose of the professor in this anecdote is not to demonstrate the fallacy of the so-called Eastern logic, but once again to demonstrate the stupidity and the unreliability of college professors. And until I hear a more specific version of this story with more corroborating details, I'm going to assume that it never actually happened, at least not in the way Zacharias tells it. Quote, "The point is, there is only one type of logic that helps us discover truth. It's the one built into the nature of reality that we can't avoid using. Despite this, people will try to tell you that logic doesn't apply to reality, or logic doesn't apply to God, or there are different types of logic, and so on." Which people will try to tell me this? who has said these things? Because the only people I ever hear talking about moral or philosophical relativism are Christians. If both and logic is really as prevalent in our culture as Geisler and Turek and Zacharias say it is, why is it I only ever hear about it from people like them? I'm not denying that there are people who hold those views, but if they're so influential in our culture, who are they? Where do they teach? What books have they written? What are their names? Most people, Eastern, Western, all over the world, agree on mathematical and empirical truths. There aren't huge numbers of people in India who would be willing to argue that 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. But philosophical truths are a different story. Eastern thinking, from what little I know of it, tends to value multiple points of view. Hence the idea that a given philosophical belief, or what we might call a spiritual belief, can be true for one person but not for another. Now, Geisler and Turek are very uncomfortable with this notion, and they exaggerate its implications beyond the point of absurdity, suggesting that if one is willing to say that one person's religious conviction is true for him but not necessarily for someone else, then one must also be willing to deny mathematics or physics. According to them, it's no fair taking a relativist view of moral truth claims unless you're also willing to take a relativist view of gravity or thermodynamics. But when it comes to philosophy, and especially to religious beliefs, relativism in this sense is just an acknowledgement of reality. You can recognize that there is a wide variety of beliefs, and even argue that this variety is generally a good thing, without having to affirm every individual belief as equally true or equally deserving of respect. Quote, "It's important to note that we are not simply engaging in word games here. The Roadrunner tactic uses the undeniable laws of logic to expose that much of what our common culture believes about truth, religion, and morality is undeniably false." That's not what the Roadrunner tactic does. And again, this common culture they refer to is a straw man, and their concept of truth is narrow and quite deniable, actually. Next section, to be burned or not to be burned? That is the question. Geisler and Turek attribute the power of the Roadrunner tactic to the law of non-contradiction, which states that contradictory claims cannot both be true in the same sense at the same time. Quote, "When investigating any question of fact, including the question of God, the same law of non-contradiction applies. Either the theists are right, God exists, or the atheists are right, God doesn't exist. Likewise, either Jesus died and rose from the dead, as the Bible claims, or he did not, as the Quran claims. One is right and the other is wrong." Notice how much they have to sand off of these claims in order to get them to fit their either-or construct. Yes, I suppose if the Christian claim was simply that Jesus rose from the dead, and the Quran's claim was simply that he didn't, then one must be right and the other must be wrong. But those aren't the claims, are they? The Bible tells a specific story of what happened after Jesus died and how and why he was resurrected. And the Quran contradicts that story with its own specific story, namely that Jesus was taken up to heaven before he could be crucified and a look-alike was nailed to the cross in his place. It's quite possible, when we consider the stories as they are actually presented in the texts, and I would argue that it's quite likely as well, that both stories are false. Also, have they forgotten about pantheism already? It was mentioned in the introduction, but now suddenly it's either theism or atheism. But if we consider pantheism as a possibility, which Geisler and Turek have mentioned previously, or if we also consider deism, which I don't think they've mentioned at all, then it's possible for both atheists and theists to be incorrect. There might be a God, just not a personal one. In that case, they're both wrong. Hume's skepticism. Should we be skeptical about it? Geisler and Turek blame David Hume for the skepticism they say is prevalent in our day. Yes, we live in such a skeptical age. How many reality shows are there about ghost hunters again? They briefly summarize Hume's empirical approach, and they describe his two conditions for meaningful claims. Condition number one, the claim is based on abstract reasoning. In other words, like a mathematical principle or something that is true by definition. And two, the claim is derived from empirical data. In order for a claim to be taken seriously, Hume says one of those two things has to apply. Quote, while he claimed to be a skeptic, Hume certainly wasn't very skeptical about these two conditions. He was absolutely convinced he had the truth. You know, you'd think between the two of them, either Geisler or Turek would have found the time to look up skeptic in the dictionary while they were writing this book. Being a skeptic doesn't mean you are doubtful of everything forever. It means you don't accept claims as true without good reason. If Hume had good reason for being convinced that the only valid claims were those based either on abstract reasoning or empirical data, then that makes him a good skeptic, not a bad one. Geisler and Turek then quote Hume from his An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, where he recommends committing books containing claims that don't meet either of his two conditions, and specifically books on religion and metaphysics, to the flames. And they say, quote, do you see the implications of Hume's two conditions? If he's correct, then any book talking about God is meaningless. You might as well use all religious writings for kindling. This would be one of those passages not addressed to atheists or skeptics then. If you care first and foremost about what is true, as Geisler and Turek claim to, and if Hume's two conditions do turn out to be a valid method of separating solid science and reasoning from what Hume calls sophistry and illusion, why panic about the implications? Also, did you catch that in that quote, Geisler and Turek just admitted that there is no empirical evidence for their God? So much for, you know, the premise of their book. Next, Geisler tells an anecdote, of course, about a college class he took in the 60s on logical positivism, where the professor, who described himself as both a Catholic and an atheist, which totally blew Geisler's mind, assigned him a presentation on the principle of empirical verifiability, which is A.J. Ayer's reformulation of Hume's two conditions. And the principle of empirical verifiability states that a proposition is only meaningful if it is either true by definition or empirically verifiable. And according to Geisler, his presentation consisted entirely of using the Roadrunner tactic to refute the principle of empirical verifiability. Quote, I stood up and simply said, the principle of empirical verifiability states that there are only two kinds of meaningful propositions. One, those that are true by definition, and two, those that are empirically verifiable. Since the principle of empirical verifiability itself is neither true by definition nor empirically verifiable, it cannot be meaningful. That was it, and I sat down. And I get the feeling, reading that passage, that Geisler is still quite pleased with himself about that. He's apparently completely oblivious to the fact that giving such a glib presentation about one of the signature ideas of one of the most influential thinkers in the history of our culture, an idea, mind you, that had been written about for centuries, made him look like an arrogant, oblivious ass, and a lazy ass at that. He goes on to describe the hushed silence in the class, which he attributes to the stunned realization of his classmates that he had just refuted logical positivism in a couple of sentences, and how the professor refused to acknowledge that his class, and indeed his entire school of philosophy, was self-defeating and false. Boy, those college professors are all untrustworthy, intellectually dishonest dicks, aren't they? Let's take a closer look at this supposedly empiricism-shattering thunderbolt. Geisler and Turek assert that the principle of empirical verifiability is itself neither true by definition nor empirically verifiable, therefore it excludes itself. But how is the empirical verifiability principle not true by definition? A few pages ago, Geisler and Turek were all about the idea that propositions are either true or false, and true is defined by them as being that which accurately reflects reality. And how do we determine what reality is? We perceive it. Evidence acquired through the perception of reality, through observation or experience, is empirical evidence. Therefore, following Geisler and Turek's own reasoning in this book, the principle of empirical verifiability must be true by definition, because any proposition that is not true by definition can only be determined to be true or false by judging whether or not it is consistent with reality. And the only way we have to judge whether or not a given proposition is consistent with reality is empirical evidence. Can Geisler really think so much of himself and so little of the last 300 years of Western thought to actually believe that the only reason the principle of empirical verification has stood for so long and been so influential in modern thought is because no one bothered to point out a self-evident and undeniable fatal flaw? Quote, "Certainly claims that are empirically verifiable or true by definition are meaningful. However, such claims don't comprise all meaningful statements, as Hume and Eyre contend. So instead of committing all books about God to the flames, as Hume suggests, you might want to consider using Hume's books to get your fire going." Yes, that was the authors of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist encouraging their readers to burn the books of David Hume. I have a better idea. As long as you've got Hume's books there already, why not read them instead of burning them? And if you find yourself disagreeing with Hume, which is perfectly all right, by the way, why not work out why you disagree with him? Formulate counter-arguments that take Hume's arguments seriously and actually address his points, rather than trying to summarily refute his fundamental philosophy using a rhetorical shortcut that you think is unbeatably clever but is actually hollow and indolent, not to mention obnoxious. Kant's agnosticism. Should we be agnostic about it? Geisler and Turek take issue with Immanuel Kant's theory of perception, specifically his assertion that though we perceive things with our senses, we never truly know the things themselves because our brains interpret the data from our senses and allow us to comprehend what our senses are detecting. Quote, Kant is saying that the tree you think you are looking at appears the way it does because your mind is forming the sense data you're getting from the tree. You really don't know the tree in itself. You only know the phenomena your mind categorizes about the tree. In short, you can't know the real tree in itself, only the tree as it appears to you. Pointless, unfunny puns, that's the ticket to being taken seriously. They continue, quote, why is it that the average person on the street doesn't doubt what he sees with his own two eyes, but supposedly brilliant philosophers do? The more we study philosophy, the more we are convinced of this. If you want to make the obvious seem obscure, just let a philosopher get a hold of it. And the more I study apologetics, the more convinced I am that if you want to rationalize your belief in something preposterous and unsubstantiated, you call an apologist. Would you like to guess how Geisler and Turek try to refute Kant? I think you've probably got it. Quote, thankfully, there's a simple answer to all of this. The Roadrunner tactic. Kant commits the same error as Hume. He violates the law of non-contradiction. He contradicts his own premise by saying that no one can know the real world while he claims to know something about it, namely that the real world is unknowable. But Geisler and Turek have already admitted that the real world is unknowable in much the same way that Kant is saying it is. In the introduction they said, quote, "We think our conclusions are true beyond a reasonable doubt. This type of certainty, say 95+% certain, is the best that fallible and finite human beings can attain for most questions, and it is more than sufficient for even the biggest decisions in life." Kant isn't saying that we can't trust our senses. He isn't saying it's meaningless to say we know things about the external world. He's saying that our minds receive data about the external world from our senses and process that data into something we can comprehend. And it is, in fact, that synthesis of sensory input with the understanding of the mind which we are perceiving when we see and hear and touch and smell and taste things. The point isn't that we can't ever gain reliable knowledge about reality. The point is that there is a separation between reality as it actually is and reality as we perceive it to be. Quote, "What we are saying is that you really do know the thing in itself. You really do know the tree you are seeing because it is being impressed on your mind through your senses." Here's the thing though. On the point about our perception of reality being distinct from reality itself, Kant was right. When you see a tree, what you are actually seeing are photons reflected by that tree which enter your eye and are absorbed by cells called photoreceptors, which convert those photons into electrical signals which are sent to the brain, which interprets those signals to form an image of the object that reflected the photons. And the other four senses operate on similar principles. Sensory input is converted to electrical signals, which are then carried by the nervous system to the brain, where they are interpreted. Perception is a phenomenon of the brain. When you look at a tree, you are not seeing the tree itself, literally. But as I said, this doesn't mean we can't gain reliable knowledge about reality through our senses. We don't have to go through life constantly doubting our eyes and our ears and such. Generally speaking, our senses and our perception are very reliable. And how do we know that they're reliable? Because we can check our perceptions against the perceptions of other people to see if they agree. If I see a tree and you say you see a tree, and everybody else who walks by says they see a tree too, and we all agree on what the tree looks like, it's reasonable to assume that we're all seeing the same tree and that the tree is actually there. So what's the difference? If the world as we perceive it is an essentially reliable representation of the real thing, why bring up the distinction between reality and perception at all? Why not just say that Geisler and Turek are essentially correct when they say that seeing is believing? Because even though our senses are usually reliable, we do occasionally see or hear things or feel things or even smell and taste things that aren't actually there. When this happens, it's called hallucination, and it's something that most of us experience from time to time. Hallucinations occur in the brain. The problem isn't with the sensory input, but with the interpreter. Our brains are perceiving things that aren't there. What this means is, seeing isn't always believing. Knowing that perception occurs in the brain, that we aren't able to see, hear, smell, touch, taste the objects themselves, that we all sometimes perceive things that aren't really there, encourages us to be skeptical of impossible or even highly improbable claims. It reminds us why extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. And those types of extraordinary claims are, in fact, I would say, the reason why Geisler and Turek bother trying to refute Kant in the first place. Because later on in this book, they're going to make some extraordinary claims, and unless they tell me something that I've never heard before, they are not going to have extraordinary evidence for those claims. That's just a guess. I could be wrong. So in order for us to be receptive to those extraordinary claims, in the absence of that extraordinary evidence, they're telling us that we have to believe not only what we see with our eyes, but also we should trust what other people see with their eyes. They are setting the table for the case for Christ, to coin a phrase. Hume and Kant are wrong. So what? Is the next section. Geisler and Turek admit that although the Roadrunner tactic has shown the philosophies of Hume and Kant to be false, the proposition that God exists is not necessarily true. Quote, "So is it true that a theistic God exists? Is there any knowable evidence that will give us reasonable certainty one way or the other?" Back to reasonable certainty again, are we? Also, note the phrase knowable evidence rather than empirical evidence. I am interested to see what knowable, non-empirical evidence Geisler and Turek have to present. How is truth known? Geisler and Turek begin their discussion of how we discover truth with first principles, the self-evident laws of logic. They mentioned the already discussed law of non-contradiction and the law of the excluded middle, which states that a proposition is either true or the negation of that proposition is true. Geisler and Turek cite their favorite example to illustrate either God exists or God does not exist. But first principles are only the first step. They allow us to formulate logically valid arguments, but they aren't sufficient for discovering truth, because to know if a proposition is true, we must be able to determine not only if it is logically valid, but also if its premises are true. And how do we determine if premises are true? Can't use the Roadrunner tactic for this one. Quote, "We get that information from observing the world around us and then drawing general conclusions from those observations." Seems like you're using empirical evidence to me, just saying. Geisler and Turek describe this process, the process of induction, of observing a phenomenon again and again and again, and eventually coming to some conclusions about that phenomenon. For example, if you're holding a baseball in your hand and you release that baseball, it falls. Assuming you're on Earth, standing on land in normal atmospheric conditions, we can confidently assume the baseball will fall every time you let go of it. Can you be absolutely 100% certain the baseball will fall when you let go of it? No. But since the baseball always falls every single time you let it go, there is no reason for you to expect anything else to happen the next time you let it go. That's induction. It doesn't give us absolute certainty. It gives us reasonable certainty based on observation and experience. So how are truths about God known? That's the next section. Why do Geisler and Turek take so much space in this chapter to discuss induction? And their definition and illustrations of induction use up more than a page, which is a lot of space when you only need a few lines to refute fundamental principles of modern philosophy. Well, quote, "We use induction to investigate God the same way we use it to investigate other things we can't see, by observing their effects. For example, we can't observe gravity directly, we can only observe its effects." I illustrated the difference between a real phenomenon like gravity and an imaginary phenomenon like God when I discussed the parable of the elephant and the 6 blind men at the end of the previous video in this series. Geisler and Turek use their own book as an example of how deductive and inductive reasoning work together to allow us to discover truths about reality. Through induction, we know that books have authors. Through observation, we know that I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist is a book. Sure enough. Therefore, we can deduce that I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist has at least one author. Quote, "Now here's the big question. Just as a book requires pre-existing human intelligence, are there any observable effects that seem to require some sort of pre-existing supernatural intelligence? In other words, are there effects that we can observe that point to God? The answer is yes. And the first effect is the universe itself." The answer actually appears to be no, but I'll get to that in the next video when Geisler and Turek blow the dust off of the cosmological argument. For now, note how they attempt to slide from pre-existing intelligence to pre-existing supernatural intelligence to God. Even if we found something in nature that implied that first condition, pre-existing intelligence, we'd still have a long way to go before we could assume the second or the third. So what? Who cares about truth, guys? In this section, Geisler and Turek argue that truth matters. And in particular, moral and religious truths matter because these truths and our beliefs about them affect both our personal choices and our choices as a society, the laws and the public policies that our governments enact. And similarly, religious truth matters because if the Bible is true, just to cite a totally random possibility, then all of those who are not Christians are destined to spend eternity in hell. And if, on the other hand, the Quran is true, then Christians, among others, might be in for a rough time in the afterlife. And that's not all. Quote, on the other hand, if the atheists are right, then we might as well lie, cheat, and steal to get what we want because this life is all there is and there are no consequences in eternity. And as we all know, refraining from a life of wanton crime and selfish, destructive impulse indulgence only because you fear the consequences of such a life after you die is the highest form of morality. Geisler and Turek are not inconsiderate of the more immediate implications of religious truth. Suppose, for instance, that the teachings of Muslim fundamentalists about Jews are true. Wouldn't it be better, Geisler and Turek ask, to teach people that God wants them to love each other instead? But here's the thing. What if that isn't true? What if the anti-Semitic Muslim teachings are true? I'm glad they aren't. But if we're pursuing truth, then shouldn't we pursue the truth, whatever it is? Are we pursuing truth, or are we advocating for a particular worldview that we've already made up our minds about? And that's a rhetorical question, obviously. And speaking of that worldview, quote, the Saudis may be teaching that Jews are pigs, but in our country, by means of a one-sided biology curriculum, we teach kids that there's really no difference between any human being and a pig. After all, if we're merely the product of blind naturalistic forces, if no deity created us with any special significance, then we are nothing more than pigs with big brains. Instead of good citizens who see people made in the image of God, we are producing criminals who see no meaning or value in human life. Ideas have consequences. Yes, the prisons are filled with atheists and Darwinists. Although at least they said blind naturalistic forces and not random accidents or something like that. That's progress, right? Although we are actually apes with big brains, not pigs with big brains. And if you think that the theory of evolution proposes that there is no difference between a human and a pig, I have to question your understanding of the meaning of the words evolution, human, and pig. Finally, are Geisler and Turek unwittingly advocating a kind of relativism here? Early in the book, they complain about how people are supposedly relativistic when it comes to religion and morality, but not mathematics or medicine or physics. But why is biology any different than those things? Just as there are established objective truths in physics, there are established objective truths in biology. Common descent, adaptation, natural selection, speciation, these are facts. These phenomena occur. They are just as real as gravity or electromagnetism. How is it one-sided to teach these facts to students and exclude contradictory claims which we know to be false? Is it one-sided to teach Einstein to physics students? Should we throw Aristotle in there just so they get both sides? Teach the controversy in physics class. That's what I say. Here's another bit from them about the consequences of religious truth. Quote, on the positive side, Mother Teresa helped improve conditions in India by challenging the religious beliefs of many in the Hindu culture, because they believe that those who suffer deserve their plight for doing something wrong in a previous life. So if you help suffering people, you are interfering with their karma. Mother Teresa taught Hindus in India the Christian principles of caring for the poor and the suffering. No, Mother Teresa taught Hindus the difference between watching the sick waste away and die in the street and watching the sick waste away and die on a cot in a warehouse hospital without painkillers. Mother Teresa believed that pain brings us closer to God. She didn't ease suffering, she sanctified it. But you know, I do agree with Geisler and Turek on one thing. It does matter what is true. I want to know the truth more than anything else. That is the star that guides me. That conviction is what pulls me up and makes me aspire to be better than I am. The conviction that truth matters, and I want to know what is true, no matter how troubling, no matter how disruptive, no matter how disillusioning. Can Norman Geisler and Frank Turek say the same thing? Before I can judge, I'll have to know what they claim the truth is. And I think I know already, but I'll let them make their claim. And I have to know what reasons they have to support their claims. And that comes next. They've spent the introduction and the first 2 chapters shadowboxing, making the unnecessary argument that it's possible to know the truth about things. Next, they begin presenting their case, and we'll see if they ask questions and seek answers courageously, honestly, and intelligently, or, to paraphrase Carl Sagan, if they choose the comforting fantasy over the hard truth. Given what I already know about apologists, I have a pretty good guess which way they'll go, but we'll have to wait and see whether or not that particular induction is borne out by the rest of the book. That is the end of Chapter 2. I will be back in the next video in the series to look at Chapter 3, which is subtitled, "In the Beginning There Was a Great Surge." All caps on surge. And as I mentioned earlier in this video, they deal mostly with the cosmological argument in that chapter. So at least it's familiar territory. That's it. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, please engage, leave a comment, ask a question, point out where I got something wrong, clarify something that I said, whatever. Leave a comment, engage, tell me how I'm doing. Thank you so much for watching this. I really appreciate it, and I will be back next week with Chapter 3.